Hello and welcome to Raider HQ After Dark. I'm your host Raider, and today's video is about Rhinitis and the different types of Rhinitis and how those types of Rhinitis can get service connected. So let me go ahead and share my screen. I'm going to try to make this a shorter video today if possible. So this is the 38 CFR Part 4, the scheduler for how we rate conditions. And there's three different types of rhinitis. There's allergic rhinitis, which is under 6522. There's bacterial rhinitis under 6523. There's rhinitis, which I've done this video a couple times because this word just gets me sideways. But there's this type of rhinitis right here. Now, the majority of veterans have or are service connected for allergic rhinitis. So when we talk about rhinitis, most people think of this type. Now, bacterial rhinitis, I've heard of it diagnosed before, but I personally have never granted it. Just nobody met the criteria for it. And the granulomatous rhinitis, I did it anyway. This one, if you've got this type of rhinitis, you might as well just saddle up a unicorn and go into your CMP examination because I've never even heard of it being granted before. So it is kind of a unique thing. So just keep that in mind. Now, I'll go through each one of these. There's technically three different ratings for each one of these. 0% you'll get if you only have the diagnosis itself with no compensable symptoms. And that goes for each one of these. So for allergic rhinitis, which many of you will be interested in, what we're looking for is greater than 50% obstruction of nasal passage on both sides or a complete obstruction on one side. So that's pretty normal. The only kind of outlier that you need to be concerned with is if you have a deviated septum. So if you have a deviated septum, you need to be able to have the examiner either say, or for like private DBQs, to have the private DBQ examiner say whether or not the deviated septum influences the 50% obstruction. Because if you have 50% or complete obstruction of your nostrils or of your nasal passage, I can't give it to you for this if it's due to the septum and the septum is not service connected. So the highest you could get is 0% unless you qualified for the next higher of, if you had polyps. Now, polyps are one of those conditions that you have to have polyps at the time of the examination. If you had polyps, say, in service and then had them removed, we could not give you credit for this because at the time of the exam, they would say, does he have polyps? Can I check the box? No, or, in that circumstance. So that's how allergic rhinitis is kind of rated. Bacterial rhinitis. Now, I had to do some research on these two types of rhinitis because, like I said beforehand, I've never actually granted them. So from what I was able to review in the manual and the CFR, there is no criteria or time limit on this. Like, for bacterial, you have to be on antibiotics for a certain amount of time. There's nothing like that. So the fact that you would have a diagnosis of bacterial rhinitis would be sufficient to be able to rate you under bacterial rhinitis. And the same thing with the granulomatous rhinitis. So the fact that you have a diagnosis should be sufficient enough to grant you under this diagnostic code rather than to pigeonhole you under the allergic rhinitis. Now, for this 10% for bacterial rhinitis, it shares a similar requirement to allergic rhinitis for 10%. However, it has the and in there. And when we have an and statement, that means there's more than one criteria. So there's the criteria on the left side of the and the criteria on the right side of the and. So you would also need to have hypertrophy of the turbinates box checked on the DBQ. And I will go over the DBQ and show you what it looks like to have kind of each one of these established on there. So if you're able to satisfy both of these criteria, then you can have the 10% rating. Now, I looked in the manual and in the regulations, and it looks like rhinoscleroma only requires it to be diagnosed. Now, there is no diagnostic tool or diagnostic imaging that is required to diagnose this. You just have to have a clinician say that you have it. That would be good enough for me because there's no criteria that forces me to have some kind of test for it. So just keep that in mind. And then when we go to the granulomatous rhinitis, this word right here, if they check the box for either one of these, as a rater, I'm going to take their word for it. And the reason why is because I've said this in other videos. The majority, I have a medical background, but not an ENT, but the majority of raters do not have a medical background. So they're going to take the word of the doctor at face value of this one. So let me go real quick to the DBQ and we'll go ahead and so the sinus and rhinitis DBQ has a whole bunch of things that it kind of covers. But for rhinitis, it's not actually very much. So when we get down here, if you're filling out a private DBQ, you really want the examiner who's reviewing your DBQ to really list all the things that they use to come to their conclusion. Okay, we do look at this, and it does kind of raise our eyebrows when this is blank, and then they have all this detailed information but don't explain how they know it. Now, once we come down to the diagnosis section, these two check boxes are going to be for the allergic rhinitis. So you have allergic rhinitis itself, and then you have non-allergic rhinitis, which would be counted as the vasomotor one. And then we have bacterial rhinitis, and then the granulomatous rhinitis. So these four are kind of your check boxes in the rhinitis realm. Now, if the examiner didn't check the boxes and they actually, if they didn't check the boxes, then they can come down here to the diagnosis section and they can, fill in the diagnosis down here. And let's go down here. So we had sinusitis, which we talked about in the other video. Now this is the part. Part B is the part that talks about rhinitis, okay? So this is going to be all the check boxes. So when we're looking at 10% for allergic rhinitis, okay, what we're looking at here is B1, B2, and B3, or a combination of them. You either have 50% obstruction on both sides or complete obstruction on left or right. So B1, B2, B3 is the 10% for the allergic rhinitis and part of the 10% for the bacterial rhinitis down here. And then B4, this is the second half of the bacterial rhinitis is 10% because it talks about the turbinates. So when we talk about this, hypertrophy of the turbinates here, because we remember that we have the and situation, and in order to get the 10%, you have to have both sides of the and thing. So you would need this checked, and then one of B1, B2, B3 for the bacterial rhinitis to be 10%. Now, B5 is for nasal polyps, and this has to do with the allergic rhinitis 30% evaluation. So in order to get the 30% evaluation, they have to check this box. They have to say you have the polyps right here and now under examination. And then box B6. So B6 has a lot going on in it because it talks a little bit about the granulomatous rhinitis, but it also has the 50% criteria for the bacterial rhinitis. So the bacterial rhinitis comes down here for rhinoscleroma. So in order to get the 50%, you would just literally need the box checked. Okay. In addition to everything above, well, because they're separate, now this is something I do want to talk about. You could actually, if you had rhinoscleroma, but you didn't have these symptoms, you could still get the 50%. They don't build on each other. So technically, you could still get the 50% if you only had the rhinoscleroma. And then the final type is the granulomatous rhinitis. So this is where the examiner has to check yes to the granulomatous conditions. They would have to check yes to the rhinitis, and then depending on what they go with, infections, and if so, they would have to describe them. I'm not going to call them on it. Whatever they say is whatever they say. So if they say other types of infections, then that would be put here, right? And they would have to be filled in, box would have to be checked. For the 50%, we're looking for the Wagner's and the lethal midline granuloma. Granuloma? Okay. So both of these boxes would have to be checked for the 100%. So in order to get the 100%, you'd have to have this checked, you'd have to have this checked, and you'd have to have this checked. So that's about it. I know I kind of rushed through that, but I'm trying to get my videos to be a little bit, a little bit shorter in length. So that's about it for these. One statement that I would like to say for the bacterial and the granulomatous rhinitis is it would make me feel better as a rater if your symptoms such as, the rhinoscleroma was also identified in your private records. That would make me feel more confident and just trusting the examiner because I could, if QRT pulled it up and said, hey, what evidence did you use to go that the examiner, had that diagnosis? What evidence did they use? And I could be able to point at it and go, oh, well, in their records on page 6, they've got it right here that it's diagnosed. So that's just a good kind of standard of practice to do in terms of, how to, double supporting your evidence so that way the rater doesn't have to question how the validity of the examiner's statement that you had the Wagner's granulomatosis with lethal midline granuloma, because I'm going to need something more than them just coming up with that in their brain. I got to be able to point to it. But anyway, that's about all I got for this one. Anyway, thank you for watching. Rater out.